Hello everyone, and welcome to session number 3 of Exploring Daniel When God Invades a Broken World. Today we're going to plunge into the detail of the book and talk about the 3 kingdom visions around which the book is structured. Before we get into the detail, however, I wanted to say a few words about what we might call prophetic perspective. We want to try to see these visions the way Daniel would see them. To do this, we can imagine the picture of a mountain range. The mountains up close, we can see more detail about them. But the mountains off in the distance, we can't see as much about them. They're not as clear to us. We can see them. They're sure to be there. They're clear as day, but we don't see quite the detail. Nor can we see the distance between the mountains that are up close and the mountains that are farther away. To see this distance, we really have to turn the picture on its side. And from this side view, we can get a clearer view of why those mountain ranges up front, why we can see them in more detail, and why we can only see a little bit the peaks of the mountains that are off in the distance. This is the way Daniel is seeing the visions. This is the way God is revealing those visions to him. And so we want to put ourselves in the place of Daniel as we're looking at these visions and seeking to interpret them. We will see more detail up front than we will about what lies in the distance. And we won't always be able to see the distance between, the time between what we're seeing up front and what we see in the distance. So let's keep this prophetic perspective in mind. We'll come back to this image later in our session to wrap it up and talk about the bigger point. Now let's take a first look at those 3 key kingdom images as we find them in the book of Daniel. As we mentioned in our last session, we find them in chapters 2, 7, and 8. In chapter 2, we had that intimidating vision of a statue with a head of gold, arms and chests of silver, a belly and thigh of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. Then a rock that comes and destroys the whole statue. Then in chapter 7, we see 4 beasts, a lion, a bear, a leopard, and the last beast is especially intimidating. It's a beast with 10 horns. And then in chapter 8, we see 2 beasts. We see a ram with 2 horns and a goat with 1 horn. So now let's dig in a little bit. What is God seeking to say to Daniel in these 3 extraordinary visions? Even this first look reveals that these visions are interwoven with one another. There are both similarities and differences between them. They're meant to be seen together. One vision feeds into the next. One vision builds on the earlier vision. They're like different patches in a larger quilt, each contributing their own colors and textures. Note, for example, the way in which the kingdom visions in chapters 2 and 7 start with 4 kingdoms, whereas the vision in chapter 8 starts with 2. At the same time, the last 2 visions, chapters 7 and 8, they contain a reference to a small or little horn that emerges from the last kingdom, whereas chapter 2 has no such reference. And then the 2 visions at either end in chapter 2 and chapter 8, they're unique. They give us explicit instructions on interpreting at least some of the images. In chapter 2, we're told explicitly that the head of gold belongs to Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 8, we're told that the ram, the 2-horned ram, that stands for the kings of Media and Persia, whereas the goat, the single-horned goat, refers to the king of Greece. So we get these explicit instruction in those 2 visions, but we have no explicit instructions in the vision of chapter 7. There is, however, one theme that unites all these visions. It's throughout a thread that weaves its way throughout all of them, and it is this idea that these kingdoms, they eventually divide, they fall apart, and God is there to defeat all of them in the end. So then, how are we going to unwind all the threads in this quilt and identify what these kingdom images are meant to represent? We would suggest beginning with the small or little horn that we find in chapter 8. Historically, how interpreters identify this horn tends to drive their interpretations of all the other images. Those who identify this little horn as Antiochus Epiphanes from the 2nd century BC, they tend to interpret the other images so that the last kingdom represented is the kingdom of Greece. Those, on the other hand, who identify this little horn as some combination of the Emperor Vespasian and the General Titus, who destroys the temple in 70 AD, they will identify the images so the last kingdom represented is Rome. And those who identify this little horn as a future Antichrist agree on one level that Rome is represented in these images, but they also insist that that last kingdom, the kingdom of that little horn, is still a kingdom out there in the future that has yet to reveal itself. These at least are the primary interpretations that drive all these other interpretations. So we're going to look then at the evidence for this little horn. What sort of evidence do the visions themselves give us about this little horn? Let's see where that evidence takes us. Providentially, we are given some concrete references in which we can anchor our interpretation. As I mentioned earlier, in chapter 2, we are told explicitly that the head of gold represents Nebuchadnezzar. This means that these visions are about history. They're anchored in history. Babylon as an empire ceases to exist when it's defeated by Cyrus in 539 BC. Then in chapter 8, we are told explicitly that the ram, the two-horned ram, represents the kings of Media and Persia. When Cyrus comes and unites the kingdoms of Media and Persia, he overtakes Nebuchadnezzar. He is the next kingdom, if you will. He brings the next kingdom into history. And then in chapter 8, we are told that the king of Greece comes and defeats the kings of Media and Persia. And that's exactly what occurs in history. Alexander the Great enters and defeats Cyrus. So these facts are not in dispute. In fact, it's interesting that regardless of when you think the book was written, in the 2nd century BC or in the 6th century BC, interpreters agreed at this point anyway that up to this point in chapter 8, we're dealing with solid history, with Alexander defeating Cyrus and initiating the Greek Empire. And it's within this context that we hear about this little horn, this small horn. As the story continues then in chapter 8, verse 8, we read that this horn at the height of its power is broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns rise up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Well, how does this square with history? When Alexander was at the height of his power in 323 BC, he's in Babylon at the former palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, and he dies of a mysterious illness. And of course, there is a struggle over succession. Who will inherit this vast empire he has amassed? Well, eventually, by 315 BC, 4 of his generals hold the field: Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Tigranes. They form their 4 separate kingdoms, and the story unfolds from there. It's tempting, of course, to see these as the 4 kingdoms mentioned in Daniel. It very well may be the case. But the truth is, there were many kingdoms that came and went. The numbers changed as the years unfolded. One kingdom rose up against another. In fact, that reference to the 4 winds of heaven, maybe it's just talking about north, south, east, and west. The fact that around the former kingdom of Judea, all around it, there would be kingdoms coming from the one united kingdom of Greece that would continue to harass and oppress it. Maybe that's the message. It is interesting, however, that the story really does pick up from this point where there are 4 kingdoms. We find that in chapter 11. It's at that point then where Seleucid is introduced into the story, the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus is a general that's vying for power. He's taking residence under the kingdom of Ptolemy. But over time, he begins to amass his forces, and by 301 BC, he supplants the kingdom of Antigonus, and he starts the Seleucid Empire. It is significant, therefore, that the Seleucid Empire, it is the next stage of the story, and it becomes the context in which this little horn arises. In chapter 8, verse 9, then, we read that out of these 4 prominent horns, another horn emerges, and it starts small, but then it grows in power. It says, the text says, to the south, to the east, and to the beautiful land. As we mentioned, Seleucid begins small as the Seleucid Empire, defeating Antigonus, but that territory begins to grow. And by the time you reach Antiochus III, it has taken over a huge portion in the east and is constantly battling in the south with the kingdom of Ptolemy, which we would know as the area of Egypt. There's that ongoing battle, and both of them are struggling over control of the former kingdom of Judea, which here in the text seems to be that beautiful land. And by 198 BC, Antiochus III had retaken this beautiful land, including the city of Jerusalem. So at that point, it did start off as a small horn, but then it grew, and we have a map here that shows how widely that Seleucid Empire expanded. So again, we have to be careful when interpreting this small horn. See, it started small, but it grew. So it's not just a reference to one individual king. It seems to refer to a line of kings that emerges from Seleucus all the way through Antiochus III. Then as the story continues in verses 10 to 12, we read about what happens with the mature horn. When this line matures, we are told that it reaches the host of heavens, that it throws down heavenly stars, that it tramples on them. This is obviously cosmic language. I mean, this is hyperbole in some sense, right? No king literally throws stars to the earth. But as we see as the story unfolds, there's a divine or cosmic aspect to all this. The heavens are fighting as well as the earth. God is especially interested in this particular struggle. And that may have something to do with the details we see as the details emerge here. It sets itself up to be a commander as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It takes away the Lord's daily sacrifice. Now, this is the clearest explicit reference we have of a concrete something happening here to identify this king. The Lord's sanctuary gets thrown down, kind of like the stars gets thrown down. And then we have this very glowing language that it prospers in everything that it did. But then this very destructive language, the truth itself was thrown to the ground. So obviously something extraordinary is happening in this revelation. Later on, when the heavenly interpreter explains this further, he says that this mature horn is a fierce-looking king. He's a master of intrigue. He becomes strong, but not by his own power. He causes astounding devastation, succeeding in whatever he does. He'll destroy the mighty holy people. Again, a concrete reference here that maybe we can get our hands around, but many people oppress the mighty holy people. If we're talking about God's people there in Judea. He causes deceit to prosper. He considers himself superior. He destroys many. He takes his stand against the Prince of Princes. Well, what does that mean? Who is this Prince of Princes? The NIV translates it with a capital P, indicating that this is somehow a reference to Christ. And then we are told finally that he will be destroyed, but not by human power. A long list of clues here. How do we fit them into history? I mean, a lot of these are very generic references that could apply to any number of things. As I mentioned, the most concrete reference here is to the taking away of the Lord's sacrifices and somehow this suppression of the Lord's sanctuary. In this Seleucid line, following Antiochus III, eventually Antiochus IV comes to the throne of the empire 175 BC. He comes with the aid of Rome. He is inserting himself, doing away, master of intrigue to assert authority there. And in retaliation for resistance in Judea, he actually begins to concentrate an effort of persecution on Judea and Jerusalem in particular. This is when he prohibits the sacrifices in the temple. He explicitly does this. He forbids the priests from performing circumcisions. He offers alternative sacrifices in the temple. There are stories of him bringing pigs and sacrificing them to the Greek god Zeus. So this starts about 168 BC and it continues until the Maccabees are able to recapture Jerusalem and reconsecrate the sanctuary. So at least at this particular, there seems to be a link between the Daniel 8 story and the forbidding of the sacrifices in the sanctuary and what happens in history with Antiochus IV. Now, there are other details that seem to fit with the profile of Antiochus. As I mentioned, he did leverage the power of Rome to secure his power base. He was not able to do that by his own power. He certainly did destroy many of the mighty holy people. That is, if you consider them the force within Judea who was resisting the changes he was seeking to implement. He was trying to convert everyone to a Hellenistic culture. To those who resisted, he did in fact oppress them and destroy them. He certainly regarded himself as superior. The term Epiphanes as actually refers to this manifestation of God. He considered himself to be a manifestation of God. He even prints that on his coins. We have an image here on the slide and also in your notes to look at. So he certainly fits that description. The whole idea that he is destroyed not by human power. He does die from sickness. I mean, he isn't defeated in battle. Later Jewish tradition interprets this as a judgment. And what about this reference to taking his stand against the Prince of Princes? Again, the NIV assumes that's a reference to Christ, and it may be on one level, but it's also interesting that Antiochus is responsible for the death of the high priest during his time. Onias III in 171 BC, Antiochus is no doubt behind his murder. So there are many of these details which seem to indicate that this does point to the historic figure of Antiochus IV. Also, and this may be another argument here, we are told in chapter 8, verse 14, that it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings to reconsecrate the sanctuary. We're going to talk about this more next week in session 4 under mysterious time references. But just generally speaking, if you convert that into days and years, it's a little over 6 years, which if you do the math, it is a little over 6 years between the death of Onias in 171 BC and the reconsecration of the temple in 164 BC, I'm sorry. Some people point at that time reference and say, well, here's another instance of perhaps these passages reconciling with the activities of Antiochus. The other piece of evidence that may be significant here is the story that we later find in chapter 11. Here we have more concrete details that bring us to this same place in the story where in this case, he's called the King of the North, will desecrate the temple fortress and abolish the daily sacrifice. So we get that same story. And there, it's pretty clear we're talking about Antiochus. Just the series of events that chapter describes, it brings us to the same place. So there are many levels at which this story then in chapter 8 points us to a concrete person by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Having said that, however, we need to be cautious. There seems to be some aspects of this vision that Antiochus did not fulfill. You could not really say in any meaningful way that his kingdom grew until it reached the host of heavens. I mean, certainly at its extent, it was a large kingdom, but it was shrinking by the time it reached Antiochus. And it's hard to understand how he could be seen to be throwing down the starry host to the ground. This seems to be language that goes beyond the activities of Antiochus. And certainly, we're not seeing somebody who prospered in everything that he did. He was thwarted, notably by Rome, on several occasions, and truth was not thrown to the ground, at least not entirely. And this whole idea of throwing down the sanctuary, well, he didn't. What does that mean? Because he didn't throw down the sanctuary. The temple still stood when he was finished. So on one level, it seems that we do have a partial fulfillment, at least, of this vision in Antiochus IV Epiphanes. However, there are some aspects of this vision that do not seem to be fulfilled during his time. So now let's turn and look at the small horn that's mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. Obviously, there's some overlap here. It's not a coincidence that this horn is mentioned in both visions. The question is, do they refer to the same person? Do they refer to the same entity? Is there some overlap between these two images? Well, in chapter 7, we're told very simply that this little horn, it emerges from the 10 horns, uprooting 3 other horns. And we're just told in verse 8 that it has human eyes and a boastful mouth. Well, that could describe a few leaders from that particular point in time, and maybe in our time, I don't know. But then in 7:21 and 22, we get a little more concrete information. As I watched, Daniel says, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. So again, a description of a struggle with the holy people there in Judea. And this prediction that the time came when they repossessed the kingdom. Okay, well that seems like some concrete information. Later, as this vision is explained, we find out a few other things, that this kingdom will be different than earlier kingdoms. It will subdue the 3 kings, as the image said. It was going to come out of 3 horns. It will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people. It will try to change the set times and laws. Again, that seems to be a fairly concrete statement. Maybe we can identify that. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for times and a half a time. And then ultimately we're told a heavenly court, and in verse 10, that was a heavenly court. This court will come and sit, take away his power, and his kingdom will be destroyed forever. So this is it. That's all the details we get about this little horn in chapter 7. Not nearly as much detail as we found in chapter 8. And I would say, just in what we see here, there's not enough information to as clearly identify this small horn with Antiochus or the Seleucid Empire. Yes, they oppressed the holy people just like many others did. There may be a parallel here with this reference to changing the set times and laws in 725. Perhaps that has something to do with Antiochus changing worship around the sanctuary. That may be what's mentioned here, but it seems kind of like an odd way to put it. And it is true that there is a period of time where Jerusalem is retaken by the Maccabees. The temple is reconsecrated, but it would be a stretch to say at that point that they repossessed the kingdom. Some folks have argued that that reference to time, times, and a half a time, we should translate that as 3.5 years. And again, we'll talk about that more next week when we talk about the mysterious time references. But if we were to say that this was the equivalent phrase of 3.5 years, well, some folks argue it was 3.5 years from about 168 BC when Antiochus started oppressing the people to the time when the temple was reconsecrated in 164 BC. So maybe this is a reference to the particular oppression of Antiochus, and it could be. However, again, the oppression lasted longer than 3.5 years. As we mentioned earlier, he had already had the high priest mentioned or murdered earlier in 171 BC. So again, it could fit with Antiochus, possibly, but the details are not clearly identifiable enough to say that with certainty. The other problem we have is we're not sure when the vision talks about Antiochus or this horn coming out of supplanting 3 other horns and out of a 10-horned beast. What would that refer to? I mean, folks have tried to propose various theories of that, but again, it's too vague in general to be very, very explicit about an identification of Antiochus IV. And I would say the other challenge we have here in chapter 7 is that language that comes at the very end of the vision. We don't have it in chapter 8. It seems to be pointing beyond what happens in chapter 8. You have that magnificent statement in chapter 7, 13 and 14. Daniel says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." I mean, clearly this did not happen at the end of Antiochus's reign. I mean, this is a revelation of God on a totally different level, this revelation of a Son of Man. And we see a similar statement near the end of chapter 7. We are told, "Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him." Well, that certainly did not occur at the end of Antiochus's reign. So something is different here about chapter 7. In chapter 8, we have what seems to be pretty clear, concrete references that at least in part this refers to Antiochus IV. But chapter 7, remember, it has no explicit references. We're left to kind of filter through that. There's still a small horn here, and it may in some degree refer to Antiochus, but there's something more going on here. Something more cosmic, something more ultimate is being revealed in this vision in chapter 7. So now that we looked at the evidence surrounding this little horn, I think we have kind of an outline of what is really happening here in these 3 visions of chapters 2, 7, and 8. We start out in chapter 2 with very concrete history. It's about Nebuchadnezzar and this oppressor in the life of God's people. And through this dream that Daniel interprets, we see that there are other oppressors out there in the future. There'll be one kingdom after another. We're not done yet. The deliverance from Nebuchadnezzar, we're just getting started. There's another progression of history that has yet to unfold. But in the end, the story is already sealed. The end of the story is already in place. The rock will come and destroy the long line of human oppressors. Then in chapter 7, this part of the story gets expanded. And now that kingdom of legs and feet that go from iron to iron and clay, it becomes this beast with 10 horns, this powerful beast filled with human power and dominion and sovereignty on this earth. It is especially oppressive to God's people. And out of that, there will be one incarnation of that kingdom, a horn that emerges that will be especially oppressive to God's people. That will mark us as being somewhere on the verge of God's engagement with history. And we'll know when it comes because he will send his Son of Man into history at that time. And the world will see that God reigns. And he will bring to an end the oppression of this line of human oppressors. He will bring an end to all of that with his power, with his sovereignty. And then in chapter 8, we kind of turn up the focus on a phase in that unveiling. It's a phase that will be executed especially on the history of God's people there in Judea. Daniel can't see how far away that might be, as he is in the 6th century BC, 400 years or so out into the future is when all this will occur. He can't see that, but people will live through that. And the vision in chapter 8 gives us enough detail that at least one level we will be able to see that this is a fulfillment of the prophecy. One will arise, who we find out is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is going to do exactly what the text says. He's going to stop the sacrifices there at the Lord's sanctuary. And when that occurs, the people who live at that time, they'll be able to know that God prophesied all this and predicted all this in the time of Daniel. But they'll also realize something else. If they live through that oppression, when Antiochus is defeated, they're going to see that part of the vision is not yet fulfilled. The Son of Man is not here. God's holy people no longer fully possess the kingdom. It's like there's the rest of the story. Something more has to be shown. God has proven himself faithful. God has proven himself sovereign. But there's still some part of the story yet to be told. And that we wait for the final visions in the last few chapters. Now, this, I think, is really the story that's unfolding in these three key visions of chapters 2, 7, and 8. There's one more piece of information we'd like to look at. It comes from the New Testament book of Revelation. In that book, we see visions that in some ways resemble some of the visions that we find in Daniel. In Revelation chapter 13, for example, in verse 1, we read this: "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name." Clearly, there's a resemblance here to the 10-horned beast that Daniel saw in chapter 7. You know, when John saw this vision, he would have thought about the beast in his day. It seems to me obvious that as he saw this vision, he would have remembered that in his day there was a beast that just destroyed the temple. 70 AD, within 20 years or so of him seeing this vision. As the people of John's day looked back on Daniel, I'm sure they would have seen references there in those visions to what they experienced, the destruction of the temple in their day. And they would have known that there were other fulfillments. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was an oppressor. They would have remembered and known the history of what happened during the time of Antiochus, so they would have seen that these prophecies were partially fulfilled through Antiochus. But yet there, in their own lifetime, was another fulfillment of this little horn. I think this speaks caution to us. Sometimes we get this idea that this little horn, it can refer to one and only one image, and I don't think that's the case. I mean, we've already seen it refers to a line of rulers in chapter 8, not just to one. And I think this example of Revelation tells us that there's 2 fulfillments, one in Antiochus, another one in Titus, and maybe still more. In the book of 1 John and 2 John, we hear about antichrists, plural, and the spirit of Antichrist. So let's be cautious as we try to assign these images. You know, we started this session by pointing out that depending on how somebody identifies this little horn, it kind of drives the rest of their interpretations. What if this little horn actually applies in multiple places? What if God is sending a bigger message? So now that we've looked through all the evidence, let's draw some conclusions. What's the big picture here of these visions in this book of Daniel? You remember we started by talking about prophetic perspective, this picture of mountains where things that are closer, they have more detail. We can see more of them. Those peaks that are off in the distance, we can see less of their detail. And then when we turn the vision on its side, we can see something of the distance from here to there, the ups and downs of history. Well, now let's apply that vision here to what Daniel sees. As the story opens, he sees what is closest to him with most clarity. The reigns of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, Media, Persia, he sees most of that. He's living in it. He's experiencing that. But then these visions stretch him out further, and he gets a glimpse of Alexander and the Greek Empire. He won't understand all the details, but he sees images of it. And then the breaking of that empire into four, and then the rising up of this other empire that turns out to be the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus IV. He doesn't know all this by name, but he can see visions, pieces of it, shadows of it out there in the future. It's kind of as far as Daniel takes us, but then the New Testament enters and there's clarification of that vision. We see clarity around Vespasian and Titus, and maybe a fulfillment of the little horn that Daniel sees in 7. We get a little more clarity in the New Testament. But even there's some mystery, because in 1 John and 2 John, we hear about antichrists and the spirit of Antichrist. All of this tells us that God has been engaged in a series of developing revelation. But all of it points to one truth, that is concrete truth, and that's true from Daniel's day till now, that God is sovereign, and that in the end, he wins. Daniel saw this rock that takes over the world. He sees a vision of this Son of Man, and the New Testament clarification comes in, and we see the rock. We see the Son of Man. It's revealed as Jesus Christ. So we see clarity that Daniel saw shadows. But for us, there's still peaks out in the future we don't understand. We still see what's closest to us with more clarity than what we see in the distance. We see more of things than Daniel saw. We saw the fulfillment of prophecy. God proved himself through prophecy. We know God is reliable through that prophecy. But we also stand kneeling before our future because there are many things we don't know. And until God chooses to reveal them fully through his Son, we're still awaiting for the ultimate fulfillment, the same fulfillment that Daniel looked for at the coming of that Son of Man. So in the end, what's the point? Well, again, the point is the Son of Man. Let's look again at those powerful verses from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This is the point of these visions. It's how God is going to bring victory in the end, and it's through this one called the Son of Man. There are many details we don't know. But whatever God's glorious victory will look like, we know it will be surrounded. It will be fulfilled. It will be completed with the arrival of this powerful Son of Man. And Daniel, he looks for him. All of us should be looking for him. All eyes should be on him for God's glorious victory. Well, thank you for joining us for this session. Come back next session when we look at the mysterious time references in Daniel. Until then, we pray the Lord's blessing upon you.